Hello class, this is lecture 6B, and we're going to talk about phosphorus in terms of soil fertility today. In this video we will review the phosphorus cycle, we will describe phosphorus fertilization practices, identify and describe some conservation practices that reduce phosphorus pollution, and we'll define the phosphorus tax. So phosphorus is a component of some pretty important compounds like adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, which is basically the energy currency that your bodies use, as well as the bodies of plants to circulate energy throughout the entire organism. It's also a critical component of DNA as well as RNA. And knowing all this, it's pretty clear that phosphorus would obviously be something that's crucial for seedling growth, as well as root growth, fruit development, and so on. So phosphorus is important to a lot of different aspects of plants. Plants that are deficient in phosphorus, they will exhibit some symptoms including stunting, or they might be thin-stemmed and kind of spindly looking plants. Leaves are also generally more dark green with purple areas, like you see on the picture on the left with the corn, and the picture on the right with a phosphorus deficient hydrangea plant. So purple colors are one of the sure signs of phosphorus deficiency. Now there are some problems with phosphorus fertilization. So phosphorus in soils is generally very low. So soils are by default pretty low in phosphorus. And the soluble sources of phosphorus are rapidly absorbed. So they're easily taken up. But there's also fixed forms of phosphorus that are tightly held. So phosphorus can be available or it can be fixed. And when it's fixed, it's very difficult for the plants to actually acquire that phosphorus. And when that happens, then very little phosphorus is available to plants. In areas where farmers can actually afford phosphorus fertilizer, phosphorus is applied at rates that are usually several times that of what the plant would need. And the reason for that is some of the phosphorus has to go to this phosphorus fixation demand of the soil. So of every application of phosphorus, some of it just gets absorbed by the soil and is never seen again. And we can think of this as the phosphorus tax. So the amount of extra phosphorus that needs to be applied in order to get the sufficient amount of phosphorus to the plant. And also with excess phosphorus application, if it's applied at too high of levels, then there are some problems with freshwater pollution. So there's kind of a fine balance between getting optimum phosphorus amounts to the plant and creating phosphorus pollution issues. In some areas, farmers can't afford to apply phosphorus, either because they don't have the resources to pay for it, or because there's no affordable phosphorus source in the nearby area. And in these scenarios, some farmers will skip it altogether, and that makes the situation worse because the soils that are already low in phosphorus to begin with, the plants will slowly mine the soil for any phosphorus that the plants can scavenge. And that further depletes the soil of what phosphorus is there, making them more difficult to manage in terms of phosphorus. And so we're going to walk you through each of the different components. So up at the top we have inputs, and then we have different soil processes in the bottom part of the figure. All right, so let's talk about inputs first. So inputs include fertilizers, plant residues, agricultural wastes, as well as municipal and industrial byproducts. So fertilizers could include just raw rock phosphate, and the primary mineral that is applied is apatite. So here's an apatite specimen in the top right picture. And apatite is mined from these large mines. Usually they're open cut mines, like you see in the top. And then this rock phosphate can be processed further into different forms of phosphorus fertilizers. So there's a wide variety of fertilizers that contain phosphorus. Phosphorus can also be recycled back to an agricultural system through the use of applying manure. So if some phosphorus is taken out by in the grain and fed to cattle or pigs or chickens, and and this feed gets incorporated into the animal. Some of that phosphorus gets gets excreted, and that waste manure can be applied back to the landscape. So it kind of closes the loop. And then humans would eat eggs or the meat of those animals, and our waste can be processed in a sewage treatment facility, and that sludge can then be processed and eventually reapplied back to the agricultural system. So, so phosphorus is in human scale recycled in some ways, or can be. It isn't always, and there's a lot of room for improvement, but it can be. There's also other organic residues and mulch that will contain phosphorus as well. So as those are decomposed, then that phosphorus eventually becomes available. There's also deposition of phosphorus, and this isn't shown in the figure, but there is some deposition of phosphorus from dust. So in some places of the world, there's phosphorus-rich soils, and those soils, as they're eroded by wind erosion, that dust can go for a long ways and eventually fall into a new landscape, and in some cases be the primary source of phosphorus inputs. So those are examples of the inputs of phosphorus into our phosphorus cycle. And then we have plant uptake. So we have this additions to the soil, and we'll have some phosphorus that's in solution, and the plants are going to be taking up phosphorus from solution. And similar to nitrogen, plants only use inorganic forms of phosphorus. So in alkaline soils, the form is typically HPO4 with a 2- charge, or in acid soils, H2PO4 with a 1- charge. So those are the two sort of primary forms of phosphate or orthophosphate that occur in nature. Plants can take up some small organic phosphorus compounds, but that's relatively rare. So the dominant forms are inorganic phosphorus in these two forms here. Now, phosphorus uptake is slow, and the reason for that is the concentration of phosphorus in solution is relatively low. So in infertile soils, it might be as low as 0.001 milligrams per liter, and it might be as high as 1 milligram per liter in fertile soils. So there's a large range in concentrations, but generally it's pretty low in concentration. Plants have some different strategies to overcome this limitation. One of those ways is to form symbiotic relationships with mycorrhizae. So if you remember back to our soil biology unit, mycorrhizae means fungus root or fungus foot, and so or fungus root, excuse me. And so in this case, we have a pine seedling in the left picture, and in the right picture, that pine seedling has formed a symbiotic relationship with some mycorrhizae. And these mycorrhizae then extend their fungal hyphae, or their mycelium, out into the rest of the soil profile. And what this does is makes it so that phosphorus doesn't have to diffuse as far in order to get into the fungus. And it's absorbed by the fungus and then transported through the fungus to the root system of the plant. And in exchange for acquiring phosphorus, the fungus, in return, gets sugars produced by the plant. So it's a symbiotic relationship where both organisms benefit. In addition to this, roots can also sense where there is a source of phosphorus. And one example of that I'm experiencing recently is the plumbing in my house is everything that's below our basement slab is all cast iron pipes. And these cast iron pipes, in some parts, the bottom has rotted away. And so some of our sewage, in this case from our kitchen sink, has actually eroded away the bottom of the pipes and was leaking into the ground. And so there's lots of phosphorus in dishwasher detergent and other soaps, as well as the food that we send down our garbage disposal. And so there was this sewer pipe that was leaking underneath our basement for a long time. And I recently had to dig all that out to fix the problems. And I found a whole bunch of tree roots that grew down a whole story into our basement and or underneath our basement slab, and found these pipes that were leaking both water and phosphorus. So roots and plants will actively grow towards sources of phosphorus to acquire such a limiting nutrient. All right, so the next part of the cycle is organic phosphorus. And so organic phosphorus includes the soil biomass or living biomass. It also includes soil organic matter, which is all the stuff that's been decomposed and processed by the microbes in some way. And there's also soluble organic matter. And this is organic forms of phosphorus that are dissolved in water. So organic phosphorus can make up a wide range of the amount of phosphorus in the soil. So of the total amount of phosphorus present in the soil, it can range from 20 to 80% of the soil phosphorus. There are three pools: again, soil organisms, the active organic matter, and then there's also the slow and passive soil organic matter. So you can sort of think of most of the soluble organic phosphorus as this active organic matter portion that's easy to decompose, as well as some of the stuff that's not dissolved. And then the slow and passive is things that take a long time to actually decompose and be mineralized by microbes. And this dissolved organic phosphorus, sometimes you'll see that referred to as DOP, and it's the most soluble form of phosphorus. And it's not really absorbed by cations like calcium, iron, or magnesium. And oftentimes this can make up half of the dissolved phosphorus that's in solution. Now there's two processes in this figure, mineralization and immobilization. So mineralization is where we have organic forms of phosphorus that are being decomposed, and as they're decomposed, the microbes are consuming the carbon, and then they release the phosphorus to solution. So it converts it from an organic form to an inorganic form, like you see here, H2PO4 minus and HPO4 2 minus. And then there's immobilization, where if the microbes are decomposing a substrate that is low in phosphorus, the microbes will immobilize or remove phosphorus from solution and incorporate that phosphorus into their biomass while they are decomposing the phosphorus poor substrate. And they won't release that phosphorus back into solution until they're done decomposing that substrate. Now, how phosphorus binds to the minerals in the soil, oftentimes they'll use things that we call a cation bridge. So these cation bridges, if you imagine here we have a negatively charged clay mineral, and we have a negatively charged HPO4 2 minus mineral, or orthophosphate. And the only way an anion can absorb onto another anion, in this term, this clay, is through a cation bridge. So we need a divalent or trivalent cation, where one charge can attach the calcium to the clay, and the other charge can attach the calcium to the orthophosphate in this case. So in alkaline soils, it's generally Ca2 plus. In acid soils, it's usually Fe3 plus or Al3 plus, so aluminum or iron. But this is what we call cation bridging, where the cations are forming a bridge between the anionic clay and the anionic phosphate. Now, one thing that can also happen with iron is that it can become tightly held with the iron and aluminum, or it can become occluded. And occluded means that it's physically fixed to the mineral. So the iron or the aluminum, as it precipitates, can basically cover up the phosphorus and make it not available until the iron and aluminum are broken down as the mineral withers. So this is not available to plants, and it's likely not going to be for many years, if not many centuries or millennia. So these are both sort of termed phosphorus fixation, and this is more prevalent in highly weathered soils with high amounts of iron and aluminum, where that iron and aluminum are fixing the phosphorus. So it's very prevalent in oxasols, where there's abundant iron and aluminum oxides. And this, but there's one way we can fix this, and that's by adding organic matter. So the more organic matter we have, the more of these sites that are available, or that are actually covered up by organic matter. So if you look at this figure on the top, here we have an iron oxide, and there's all these OHs on the outside. And as phosphorus is applied to the soil, some of the phosphates are going to become tightly bound and actually become part of this iron oxide. And so this is phosphorus that's fixed to the iron oxide mineral. Now, some of these bonding sites can be covered up by organic material. Now, when that occurs, that actually decreases the phosphorus fixation demand of that soil. So it makes it easier to actually manage from a phosphorus fertilization standpoint. So we call this phosphorus fixation, where this phosphorus is becoming fixed to the colloidal minerals. And we can determine what the condition is of a soil and how much phosphorus it's going to fix by doing a sorption exercise. And you guys did this in lab in the virtual sorption activity. But here, what we can do is we can apply different concentrations of phosphorus in solution and shake it with soil for several hours, and then we can measure how much phosphorus remained in solution afterwards. And as we increased the amount of phosphorus that was in the solution initially, we eventually reached sort of a plateau for how much can actually be absorbed by that soil. And so we prefer soils that have a low fixation demand, because that means there are less sites that require phosphorus to be filled or filling that site. And so if we apply more phosphorus, it can actually be used by the plant as opposed to becoming permanently lost to the soil. But if we have a soil with a large absorption capacity, in this case soil B, then we might have some issues, because we're going to have to apply a large amount of excess phosphorus just to satisfy this phosphorus fixation demand. And what's happening with this phosphorus fixation is phosphorus is forming an inner sphere complex. And this inner sphere complex is where the oxygens on the mineral are actually being shared by the oxygens of the phosphorus. So we have phosphate, so one phosphorus and four oxygens. And in this case, we have two oxygens being shared, forming an inner sphere complex with the aluminum mineral, as you see here. So that is one example of phosphorus fixation. And again, organic matter can cover up some of these sites, so we can actually reduce the phosphorus fixation demand because it's covering up some of those oxygens, and it's not going to force the phosphorus to share oxygens with the mineral. So the inner sphere complex of phosphorus, generally these inner sphere complexes form in highly weathered soils, or soils with a high affinity for phosphorus. And one man who was actually one of my former professors, Dr. Eugene Campreth, he discovered that phosphorus demand of these soils, once that's satisfied, these soils can actually be fertilized like any other soil. And so if you're starting off with a brand new soil that you're trying to productively farm, when you first start out, you're going to have to apply a large amount of phosphorus to satisfy this phosphorus fixation demand. And then once that's satisfied, you can apply phosphorus at a much smaller rate that's more in line with the agronomic rate that is only what the crop actually needs. And this led to modern day crop production in South America and is responsible for improving agriculture in many parts of Africa. So this was a pretty revolutionary idea, and it really opened up the potential for agricultural production in the southern hemisphere. So Dr. Campreth is a very humble guy from Nebraska, and he made this big discovery, but because he's so humble, he never really kind of touted this discovery. And so I try to try to explain the importance of this discovery as much as I can. And I should say one more benefit of banding is the phosphorus is actually put below the surface, whereas broadcast, the phosphorus is applied to the entire surface. And the advantage of that, of banding, is because the phosphorus is below ground, or is below the surface, if there's erosion that's going to happen, that sediment is not going to be as phosphorus laden as it would be if it was soil eroded from a field where broadcast phosphorus was applied. So with broadcast phosphorus, you have a lot more phosphorus applied across the entire surface. And so if any of that is eroded, you're losing the phosphorus. But in a banding scenario, then most of the phosphorus is below ground. So if there is some erosion, you're less likely to lose as much phosphorus, and there's less potential for pollution of phosphorus. Now, one example for research that was done here at K-State related to this is shown on this slide. And what it shows is a heat map where the more blue you see, the more phosphorus that is plant available. And so, so this is long-term strip tillage experiments, where in one experiment, all the phosphorus is applied as bands, and that's what you see on the left, where it's all broadcast. And then on the right side, it was all applied as a deep band, about 6 inches below the surface. And so you end up with having most of your phosphorus right below the corn row, or whatever row crop you're growing. And so how this graph is set up is the left side is the row, and if these are on 30-inch rows, so 15 inches would be directly in between two rows. And same with this figure. And then we have depth in 3-inch increments down to 12 feet. And so 6 inches below the surface, right below the row, is right where the deep band was placed. And so in this area, the phosphorus fixation demand of the soil has been satisfied, and any applied phosphorus beyond that amount is readily available for plants. Whereas for broadcast phosphorus, the same idea happens or occurs, where at the surface there's plenty of available phosphorus for the plants, and because there's no tillage being used, we get this sort of a stratification that occurs where there's less phosphorus down below. Now, both of these are fine, but one benefit you get with deep band is that if there's a dry year, the phosphorus is still able to be acquired by plants, because if it's a dry year and we have dry soil, all the phosphorus is in the driest part of the profile, and it's hard for the plants to acquire that phosphorus if it's dry soil. So there is some advantage from a moisture content standpoint in dry years. There's a benefit to deep band over broadcast. There's also an advantage in that if there's erosion happening, most of the soil that's eroded is low in phosphorus, as opposed to broadcast, where if you have any erosion at all, it's going to be the most phosphorus-laden sediment. So as far as the yield goes, as far as crop yield goes, there's not really a benefit from one over the other in most years. So this wouldn't be something worth going and changing out a piece of equipment for. But if you're growing crops and you're going to use, say, strip tillage, then it would be to your advantage from a phosphorus management standpoint to actually start doing deep band, because there's less risk of phosphorus erosion, and you also get some benefit of having phosphorus be available even in dry years. Now, some plants take an active role in actually acquiring this phosphorus. One of the ways the plants do that is in acidic soils, in calcareous soils, or neutral to slightly alkaline. Some plants, like beans, for example, and other legumes, they will acidify the rhizosphere. And when we have a high pH and high amount of calcium, as we lower the pH, that actually makes phosphorus become more available. So legumes acidify the rhizosphere to make phosphorus more available in neutral to alkaline pHs. And then corn can increase the pH of the rhizosphere, which advantages it in acidic soils. So acidic soils where lots of phosphorus is bound with aluminum and iron, as the pH goes up, then there's less iron and aluminum in solution, and so the corn is actually able to get more phosphorus. So plants can modify the pH of the soil in order to get more phosphorus. Now, some plants also exude organic acids that will make phosphorus more available. So citrate is one example of an organic acid that plants can exude to make precipitated phosphorus suddenly become soluble and go into the soil solution so that the plant can take it up. So there's lots of strategies used by plants, and these are just some examples. And for phosphorus, in terms of pH, you'll notice that as we get more acidic in pH, so pH of less than 5.5, there's very little phosphorus available, and that's because phosphorus becomes bound up by iron and aluminum. And then at a pH of say 7.5 to 8.5, phosphorus becomes less available because it is precipitating with calcium. And so in that scenario, phosphorus is less available. So a pH between 5.5 and 7.5 is kind of the target pH for phosphorus availability. Now, this doesn't hold true in all scenarios, but in most soils, it works out so that a neutral pH is the best scenario for phosphorus availability. Okay, so I'm going to do a graded discussion. And so what I want you to do is go onto Canvas and post a response to these questions. But I want you to read this article, and it focuses on a scientific paper that was published that highlighted the phosphorus tax. And this is the amount of extra phosphorus that would have to be applied just to satisfy the phosphorus fixation demand of soils in parts of the world that are developing. So there's growing populations and a growing need to produce more crops. And in order to actually intensify the agriculture in those regions, we have to be able to apply more phosphorus. And so that's well and good, but one issue we have is that there are limited amounts of phosphorus that are easily mineable or easily extractable from phosphate mines. And so it starts to become sort of an interesting scenario where we're trying to balance intensifying agriculture in developing areas with the amount of phosphorus that's currently available from mines. And so what I want you to do is look up this number here. So the quote is, intensify crop production on farms atop phosphorus binding soils worldwide would require paying a phosphorus tax equal to as much as blank % of recent global phosphorus fertilizer consumption. So try to see if you can find that in the article. And then also, I want you to identify what are the 4 ways mentioned to reduce the risk of phosphorus fixation and reduce this phosphorus task. So there are 4 strategies that are identified in there. So read the article, post your discussion on Canvas, and I'll be curious to see what you say. All right, now going back to our phosphorus cycle, the next step is phosphorus losses. And the primary way we lose phosphorus is through erosion. So phosphorus is generally considered immobile. So that means that leaching is usually pretty minimal in most soils. So leaching is minimal, and it only really occurs when soils are more or less phosphorus saturated because there's so much phosphorus that's been added to the soil. Now this does occur because if you think about some of the areas of the U.S. where livestock production is very common, in those areas there's a lot of manure that's applied, and it's applied to the same field year after year after year. And some of those soils can become so laden with phosphorus that phosphorus becomes very soluble and very easily leached into the groundwater or into drainage water or drainage ditches. And that becomes then a water quality problem. So Leaching is rare, but it is possible depending on how high of phosphorus concentrations we have. But most of the phosphorus loss that occurs is from runoff and erosion. So if there's phosphorus that's bound to a soil particle, and that soil particle gets eroded, washed through the runoff into a nearby stream or ditch, and eventually to a river somewhere, that could eventually reach a reservoir, or just cause algae blooms in those water systems, and that in and of itself is a problem. So phosphorus pollution in fresh waters is a very common problem, and it's also very concerning. So in fresh water, the most common limiting nutrient is phosphorus. There's usually plenty of nitrogen, but there's usually not enough phosphorus in freshwater systems. And so when there's pollution from runoff and all this erosion that's occurring, that phosphorus can trigger an algae bloom, and that causes more algae to grow. And as the algae balloons, eventually the algae die and fall to the bottom of the water column, where bacteria then decompose that algae. And that decomposition of this algae bloom is what triggers a low oxygen event, because the microbes are consuming oxygen as they're decomposing this organic material, and that use of that oxygen depletes the water column of oxygen, and that can in turn cause a fish kill. And so fish kills will hurt recreation, because no one wants to swim or fish in a lake that's completely filled with a bunch of dead fish in it. Also, the algae blooms themselves, if it's cyanobacteria, can cause some human health concerns, like neurotoxins that are produced and can hurt humans and even kill humans if they either breathe it in or ingest it. So that's why in some cases we have beach closures due to algae blooms. So this is also an issue if that water that now has neurotoxins in it from those algae, if that water is used for a drinking water supply, it's very difficult and really not practical to remove the neurotoxins from the water. So the best way to combat this is to actually prevent the inputs of phosphorus to a reservoir, and that's generally through cooperation with farmers in the local area, or with local cities that are dumping sewage from the sewage treatment facilities into rivers. So those are both kind of two common sources of phosphorus, either erosion from land or runoff from cities, or sewage treatment excrement or waste that's coming from a treatment facility. So phosphorus is, again, the dominant limiting nutrient in freshwaters. And so when there's phosphorus inputs going into a freshwater system, we get algae blooms. Now, looking at this picture, there was an experiment that was done in Canada in the 70s at Seven Hills Lake, where they put in this barrier right down the middle of a lake. And on one side, they use it as a control, and on the other side, they added phosphorus. And prior to this, there was some debate over whether nitrogen or phosphorus was the most limiting nutrient in freshwater systems. And they clearly showed that phosphorus was the most limiting nutrient. And now that assumes that there's nitrogen available, but in most cases there is. So phosphorus, by and large, is the one nutrient that can help trigger algae blooms. Now, some of the ways that we can reduce how much phosphorus goes into a watershed. One is to prevent erosion, and so we can do this by using less intensive tillage practices, using cover crops, using no-till, leaving as much residue on the surface as we can, conservation tillage, and so on. Another way we can do this is to use riparian buffer strips. So this could be forested riparian buffer strips, or it could be grass filter strips. But the idea is that if we have standing plants that can slow down the water as it's running off of the uplands toward a stream, as soon as that water hits these buffer strips, that water is going to slow down. And as it slows down, the sediment that is being held by the water will start to filter out and get trapped in all this vegetation that's along a stream. And so over time, we accumulate sediment in this filter strip or in this buffer strip, while the water can still kind of percolate down and eventually get into the stream. But the phosphorus stays behind as part of the sediment that was filtered out. And so that's one way that phosphorus is prevented from getting into the stream and eventually to a reservoir downstream. Another way is the trees along a stream like this can actually help prevent stream bank erosion. So the less stream bank erosion there is, the less sediment and the less sediment-bound phosphorus there is that actually makes its way into the water and heading downstream. And one side benefit of this is that by creating these buffer strips, we're also providing habitat for ducks, turkeys, pheasants, and other desired wild game that are often hunted. And so you see a lot of cooperation between, say, the NRCS and local soil and water conservation districts and wildlife groups like Ducks Unlimited and National Wild Turkey Federation and so on, because they know that these practices both help promote water quality but also provide habitat for these animals and others. So some important notes for phosphorus. One is that phosphorus is generally not mobile because it's held tightly to the soil. Phosphorus can contribute to phosphorus pollution in freshwater systems when the soil particles are lost due to erosion. Phosphorus absorption is where phosphorus is held tightly. It can desorb back into soil solution, but generally that's not very speedy. So once phosphorus becomes fixed, it's hard to get it back into solution. So phosphorus absorption is where it's held lightly, or held tightly, but not super tightly. It's still eventually plant available. Phosphorus fixation is where it's held very tightly, but it cannot desorb back into soil solution, at least not at a fast enough rate where it could be used within the same growing season that it became fixed. So it's going to take many years, if not hundreds of years, for that phosphorus to become available again.